Okay. Sorry about that. Technology got a little wonky, but this is the second chapter of the lecture, or a short second chapter before the third and final chapter. So as I was saying, Greeley proposed the American frontier, quote unquote frontier, as a kind of an escape chamber, a decompression chamber, where all this pressure in the industrialized northern cities, all this poverty could be released. You have agrarian farmers, democracy would be wholesome, etc., etc. But the reason I put the word frontier in quotes is that it wasn't just some American frontier. The land was the home of native communities. Uh, since the beginning of the quarter, or excuse me, the beginning of the semester, we've been talking about the relationship between the colonial, European colonial powers and indigenous communities. And if you can remember, one of the first things I asked you to read that represented an indigenous worldview was Mittark's Will, which was a claim to land in the Northeast from the 17th century. It was a land claim. Since contact, there has been this contestation over land. Indigenous groups were in the Americas prior to any European groups. But as the European population grew, inevitably, there were conflicts with native groups who were thinking, okay, these are our homes. If you want to negotiate for treaties to make certain land claims, that can potentially work. But the desire for more and more land wasn't anticipated, I don't think, by most native communities. The numbers of people pouring into the Americas was not anticipated. So the very first text from the Americas we read, Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative, was a consequence of this expansion in contact and the movement further away from the eastern seaboard. She was taken captive by the Narragansett tribe in the Northeast as a consequence of King Philip's War. As we talked about in class, from the perspective of the native communities, it was probably, we could say it was an anti-colonial war. It was a claim about their land and their life ways. From the Protestant, the Puritan perspective, as we discussed, the captivity represented God's punishment or choosing for potentially spreading too far from the literal Puritan original colony and the figurative faith. Well, by the late 19th century, the spread of settlers had moved even further east. This slide here represents how far that spread was moving after the Civil War. If you can look on this map, so I just want us to think about one powerful indigenous nation, and that nation is the Sioux. The term Sioux was actually coined by French Canadians to encompass a culturally, linguistically related nation composed of three different groups: the Yankton, the Lakota, and the Dakota. I want to use this group as a specific case study because Zikalasa was Yankton, so she was a Sioux Indian. Now, if you look at this image here, this this map of the United States, this little black square shows us what the larger image, this larger image represents, which part of the United States. And this was the territory that the Sioux controlled, essentially. This is their territory. Here's the Yanktonai. So this was the Kalasas community here. Lakota down here. Dakota over here. Yankton here. Or excuse me, this was the Kalasas group, the Yankton here. One of the things I want to emphasize is that we need to be careful not to assume that the U.S. was this mighty colonial force and native communities were victims to this imperial colonial power. Retrospectively, the expansion of America further west, it may have seemed like that, but in fact, as I say here, for much of the 18th and 19th century, the Sioux were more powerful and more feared by other tribes in the American military. It's important to remember that it wasn't just these European powers that coming into the Americas that dictated how things went. In fact, it was a delicate process of negotiation, and it wasn't always conflict. I said that from the start. Settlers wouldn't have survived if it wasn't for native hospitality. To this day, we have Thanksgiving to commemorate that, or at least in part it should commemorate that. The French were in Canada to trade for beaver fur, for fashion in Europe, and they totally relied on powerful tribes like the Iroquois and Huron. So we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that the English and the French were totally in control. They were very much controlled by the wills of native peoples. They had to negotiate the will of native communities, and the Sioux was a hugely powerful nation. In part, their power, they became more and more powerful, interestingly enough, as a result of contact because of the horse. The horse was introduced into the Americas in the 15th century with the Spanish, and the Sioux adopted that technology, the technology of the horse, really effectively, really efficiently, and became really powerful. And so by the end of the Civil War, when we first, in the wake of it, were readings at Kalasas in 1900, the Sioux remained a very powerful nation. So here, if you look at this map, this is contemporary. This is the state of Minnesota, the contemporary state of Minnesota, the state of Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota. This is a huge, huge territory. Okay, and this was what the Sioux controlled. I one time took a bus from down here, basically from here in North Carolina all the way to here, Seattle. And I took a bus that went through the Dakotas, and it was like, it took me a day driving on a bus, like CTM style, a day just to cross this territory. And this is before the automobile. So this nation, the Sioux were powerful, okay? That's the point. Oops. Sorry. Technical glitches. Okay. As I note in this last bullet point here, as American settlement and the Transcontinental Railroad cut further into Sioux territory, there were increasing skirmishes between the tribes and the settlers. The railroad was kind of this vision that different politicians really were enamored with, in love with, in the mid and late 19th century. If it could connect the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States, and people could take a train all the way to the country, that seemed like a pretty phenomenal thing. But the train had to be built across all kinds of native land, and native communities would sometimes attack train outposts or workers building the train because it was going through their land. You may have seen American Western movies. Most of the Westerns are set after the Civil War, and they kind of glorify or romanticize the frontier lifestyle of the cowboy figure. And usually that's in relationship to the plains, frequently to the plains warfare. So this area that this little square down here represents is also called the Great Plains. And these different tribes in this area are known as some of the Great Plains tribes. So in addition to the Sioux, you have the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Pawnee, the Omaha. Those are all major native groups in the Great Plains. Just as a last point to note the power of the Sioux after the Civil War, there was a famous battle, and I guess I should say that with the railroad moving west and immigrants moving further west, and with these increasing skirmishes, the government wanted to make sure that native communities were settled, and they no longer were required to, or basically they no longer had the freedom to move anywhere they wanted to move within their territory. They wanted them to be confined to reservations, to specific allotments of land where they would live. The Sioux, being confined to a certain area of land was kind of dissonant, or it didn't go with the life and philosophy of many tribes on the Great Plains like the Sioux, because their life, for instance, was linked up to the migration of the buffalo herd. It was a major source of food. It was a major source of clothing. They used buffalo. They used all of the buffalo for food, for clothing, for their teepees. They used buffalo skin for their teepees. And so kind of following the buffalo herd was part of their life way. So they were nomadic as a consequence of this. And so the government asking them to be confined to a certain area of land was kind of asking them to abandon a whole life way that was really important to them. So needless to say, many Lakota, many of the Sioux didn't want that, didn't accept that, and they fought back. And they fought back very well, because they were masterful horse soldiers. And one of the most devastating battles in the American imagination in the late 19th century is known as Custer's Last Stand. And this was a battle between a number of different plains tribes, the Cheyenne, as well as the Sioux, were resisting being forced to go on a reservation. They didn't want to do that. And there was a Civil War cavalryman known as Custer, General Custer, who was kind of a decorated soldier in the Civil War and supposedly known for his bravery, but he was also not particularly sharp. Some later people say there's a famous military school in the United States known as West Point, and Custer was like last in his class, last in his cohort at West Point. And so he wasn't, some of his tactical decisions in battle weren't particularly wise, I guess you could say, or decisive. And so I think it was 1876-ish, around 1876, he had followed the Lakota and Cheyenne into the Northwest, into what is now Montana State. And he chose to attack a camp, and so he charged. There were a number of different generals, and he led 200 soldiers into this camp where the Cheyenne and Sioux had were kind of on the run and trying to avoid Custer. And Custer didn't coordinate his attack with other men, and so this famous general was killed. The Sioux warriors and Cheyenne warriors killed all these American cavalrymen to a man. And at this time, this is kind of the first time it was like the newspapers would broadcast or have this information really quickly, because the technology of the telegraph had spread in the period. And it shocked everyone in the eastern United States, which is to say, in the late 19th century, one of the most famous Civil War cavalry generals was devastated, and his troops were killed to a man by the Sioux. And this shocked the East. On one hand, it shows you that the Sioux, how powerful the Sioux were. We shouldn't think, even in the late 19th century, that the U.S. military was more powerful than they were. On the other hand, it was a sad, unfortunate historic turn, because after Custer's last stand, after the Lakota victory, at the battle, they call it the Battle of Greasy Grass or the Battle of Little Bighorn. After their victory, the American military really worked harder to confine the Lakota to the reservation spaces, and ultimately they were kind of rounded up and forced to return to the Dakota areas, which was in essence their homeland, but they were confined to a large reservation, but a reservation nevertheless. Okay, and that leads us to a discussion of legislation that was passed in the wake of these battles, legislation known as the Dawes Act or the Allotment Act, that really shifted the way people thought about Native communities in relationship to the American national body and citizenship, and influenced the lives of so many Native people, including Zitkalasa. And I will talk about that in my next chapter. So I'll turn to that in just a moment.